welcome back to Le Oranger, our little show. I'm Taylor,
I'm Patrick.
and unfortunately, we have a little sad news. Thoughts and prayers, unfortunately, bit the dust.
You
The
know,
save file did.
she's in our thoughts and prayers.
She is, but she will be
She
reborn
will live again.
shortly. Yeah, and Patrick will have to. I'm slightly suspicious that this is a plot on Patrick to lower his death count for the first 2
Oh,
hours.
right. That would be smart. No, you can keep my death count where it was.
All right,
That's
all
fine.
right. But yeah, so we're starting over. Thoughts and prayers, little adventure, which is fine. At least we figure out how to get saved now. But anyway, onwards and upwards to the actual subject of this video. So, as all 12 of our longtime viewers will know,
Yes. Right.
we have a tendency to make fun of the French a little bit, just a little bit. So as reparations, we will be devoting this video to a long-form discussion of the French Revolution.
We love the French.
Well, mostly the French. There's good, there's some good people.
and a few of them, I'm sure, are good people.
Yes, of course. They're revolutionaries and potheads, but I'm sure some are good people.
They're potheads?
That was just me coming up with something. They're pretty close to the Dutch. Netherlands is right there.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this video is gonna mostly be about. They also lost to the Swiss in the Euros, which is really funny, but completely tangential. Yeah. So this video is gonna be about the French Revolution, and specifically, we'll be talking about the sort of building off of the last episode. We'll be talking about the Marxist perspective on the French Revolution. We'll first look at the traditional perspective, which for a long time was like the orthodox and accepted theory of the French Revolution in the historian community. We'll then be looking at objections to it and problems people had with it, both like problems that were made up as well as legitimate objections to the theory. And then we'll be moving on to the sort of modification of the traditional Marxist theory to take into account that new information, but also while reaffirming a lot of the central hypotheses of the sort of Marxist perspective. Right?
Yep.
Patrick, feel free. I've prepared the notes for this session because Patrick's playing.
Because Patrick doesn't know anything about the French Revolution.
Yeah. This is basically just me going on a fucking history major rant this whole episode.
Yeah, no, I dig it. I love the French Revolution. I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot, so. I mean, okay,
yeah.
to be clear, I do know things about the French Revolution, but not like you do, so I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. Confirmed, Patrick knows things.
Yes.
Yeah.
I know a thing or two.
But yeah, so whenever you have a question or a thought, just jump in, interrupt me.
What if I have a prayer?
No, we don't accept those
Okay.
here.
All right, that's fine.
Prayer's not accepted.
Let's see how fast I can do this whole intro again.
Here we go. I would get out of time, but I'm too lazy.
It's okay.
Anyway.
That's okay.
So, we'll start off with the traditional Marxist perspective, which, as I said, was surprisingly the orthodox among historians for a pretty long time, at least for most of the 19th and early 20th centuries. They would use euphemisms and call it the social interpretation instead of using the big bad M word to talk about it.
Right.
But it was pretty widely accepted for a long time. The traditional Marxist perspective views it as a class conflict between the burgeoning bourgeois class, which was very young at this point.
What year was it?
The French Revolution began in 1789, and it's a lot harder to say when the end was.
Right.
But I think Napoleon took power, right at the turn of the century, something like that. I don't remember the time.
All right.
Okay, so Napoleon took power in 1799. That's about when I thought. So the more or less Republican period of the French Revolution was 1789 roughly to 1799, about a decade. And that's the period that this discussion is mostly going to focus on. We're not going to talk too much about Napoleon, and we're also not going to talk too much about the specific like people, events of the revolution. We'll mostly be focusing on like the broad societal processes at work. But so yeah, back to the sort of Marxist perspective on the French Revolution. Essentially, it viewed it as a class conflict between the bourgeois class against the nobility. The bourgeois, which was what they were called at the time by the actual French. That's where the word bourgeoisie comes from, that Marx uses later on. The bourgeois were essentially the class of merchants, artisans, shopkeepers, plantation owners, small businessmen, wealthy people who didn't have noble blood, right? And they were in conflict, according to the original theory, with the aristocracy, the nobility, who, rather than being businessmen who like sell products on market, they got their wealth through inheritance, through feudal obligations,
through primitive accumulation.
Yeah, essentially. And their whole thing was their power was based off of lineage and feudal rights and obligations, and not like gaining wealth through the market, essentially. And so the basic thesis holds that these two classes were in conflict with each other because the aristocracy was dominant. There was still a French king, Louis XVI, who ran society, and they would run it, more or less primarily in the interest of the nobility. A lot of the top positions in the government were reserved for nobility. All the top positions in the army were reserved for the nobility. The nobility got to like tax and regulate commercial actions and gain money from that, so especially the king. So the nobles were still dominant in society, but the bourgeois class was quickly developing due to a whole range of processes that we'll get into later, and was coming to stand on equal footing more or less with the nobility. And the basic theory Marxist interpretation holds that the bourgeois got to a point where they were so powerful that they just challenged the domination of the nobility over society, overthrew the nobility, and established a more or less capitalist dominated republic.
Liberal democracy, right? Yeah.
Liberal democracy, right. And that gets more complicated when you talk about Napoleon, but that's kind of why we're not focusing on him for now.
Right.
But that's the essential, basic, traditional Marxist theory, which again was surprisingly the dominant among historians for quite a long time. Now we look to the haters, you might say.
The haters.
But who also... Huh?
I said the haters.
Yep. These are the people who, found problems, real or imagined, with the Marxist perspective, and have, brought those challenges up. And they have steadily, for roughly around, I want to say like post-World War II, they came to historical thought on the French Revolution, especially the revisionist school, which I'll talk more about in a minute. So like mid to sort of like late, early to the turn of the millennium, these two schools have been dominating historical thought more so than the Marxist one on the French Revolution.
All right.
That's the rough timeline.
Cool.
But there's basically two schools among these. The more dominant one is called, and this is a very loose category, the revisionists. There's other names for them. I'll just use that name because that's the one I know. So yeah. Nice. And yeah, you're doing pretty good. I don't think you've died yet.
Oh, I have not.
You've not fallen off that cliff.
Yeah, I know. Did you see how fast I killed the asylum demon?
Yeah. I wasn't paying too much attention, but it was pretty impressive.
Yeah. Oh, here's where I die.
Yeah. There you go. So there's two main schools. the revisionist is a very broad school that's composed of a lot of people. One of the sort of premier examples of them, and I might be saying his name wrong, is this dude named Alfred Caban, who you can look up and get more details on if you want. Also, at the end of the video, I'll list some sources that I use to sort of inform this video that people can look into on their own time if they're especially curious. But all of these sources come from a class I took on the French Revolution last quarter that I use on our final paper, which was about all the stuff I'm talking about. Anyway, back to the revisionists. The revisionists, they're a broad category, but essentially they still acknowledge the importance of class in the French Revolution, but they challenge its dominance. And the way they do that is by pointing out... Huh?
I said, really?
Yes, they don't believe it was the dominant force in the French Revolution. They point to a lot of different things, but one of the common things they point to is this idea of culture being the dominant motivator.
Oh boy! Oh god! It's like this is an argument in sociology all the time. The cultural. Yeah. Oh my god! I fucking hate this argument. All right, go on.
I do too. Yeah. And we'll be refuting it soon enough.
Excellent. Excellent. That's what I like to hear.
Hell yeah. So yeah. Essentially, the way they sort of reject the social interpretation, the Marxist class-based interpretation of the French Revolution, is through a number of ways. One of them is they point out how in the beginnings of the revolution, the movement for reform wasn't dominated by the bourgeois. It was first pioneered by liberal aristocrats, which is their origin we'll talk about a bit later. But also they talk about how not all of the bourgeois were united in support of the revolution. There were examples of businessmen, merchants, etc., that opposed the revolution, and they did exist. They point out that most positions in the revolutionary government were dominated by lawyers instead of actual businessmen themselves, which is one of my least favorite objections, because that's literally how it's always been. But we'll address that one. We'll address that one again in a little bit. So essentially their point is, maybe class played a role, but it wasn't the dominating thing, because clearly the classes weren't united on one side or the other.
Right.
And we'll get into detail about why, there's some truth to that, but it's more complicated than they're making it appear to be. And they're using this sort of tangential fact to dismiss the theory that is innately driving process behind them.
Right.
So that's the main school of objections to the Marxist theory. There's another one which I'll only briefly talk about. It's the smallest school. No one really cares about it or takes it seriously. It was developed. It's called and I did look up the pronunciation beforehand, but I'm still gonna
Nice.
It's called the Tocquevillian School on the French Revolution.
Oh, Alexander de Tocqueville.
Yes, that's the guy.
Yeah.
Big libertarian.
Yeah.
From my brief research on him, major asshole. Anyway, this is the least popular school, so it's not super relevant, but for the sake of being complete, I'll briefly mention it at least. Essentially, these guys are they reject any influence of social class in the French Revolution, and they basically ignore the motivations of everyone in the revolution. They're actually, in many ways, they're more deterministic than the Marxists, which is interesting because that's a common critique of Marxism.
Right.
Anyway, they're the only thing that mattered in the French Revolution was power of the state, and that's because as libertarian or verging on anarcho-capitalist from the sounds of it, he's the state is the problem in everything, and the state interfering with our beautiful markets explains every problem in human history.
Right,
apparently.
of course, yeah.
Of course. So basically, he argues that, even though the revolutionaries want to loosen the grip of the government, they were basically in service of this broader modern trend of centralizing state power. and so were the counter-revolutionaries. And basically what anyone did in the revolution almost didn't matter, because at the end of the day, it was always going to end in the state becoming more powerful. And he points to, as evidence for this, to the terror.
Right. That's actually kind of a really interesting argument that I would almost be inclined to agree with, but not based on its, like I agree with its premise, but not based on its reasoning. You know what I mean?
Yeah. In a sense, I disagree with it because I think there are class based explanations for the terror and for Napoleon's rise to power. And so, I don't necessarily accept the idea that it was inevitable that it would only end up centralizing state power. Also, he completely ignores the tremendous influence of the French Revolution on the development of civic equality and other sort of more capitalist social developments that were caused by the French Revolution. He only focuses extremely specifically on the state became more powerful.
Yeah.
And he ignores essentially everything outside of that perspective and doesn't acknowledge the broader social ramifications of the revolution, which in many ways were more in service of egalitarian values than authoritarian ones. So that's another conversation.
Yeah.
Other things that I think I mentioned, but it's also called the state modernization theory because he basically thinks that inevitably we'll just end up in 1984 and as part of modernizing, states just get more and more powerful.
And he was right.
There's evidence for that. But I don't think that's necessarily a reason to think that the state being powerful is a permanent feature of society, or we're doomed to always go in that direction.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is kind of what he sort of implies, even though he himself is a libertarian. So I don't know what his theory for reversing that is, and I'm not sure if you care to know. But anyway,
as with all conservative libertarian arguments, I always go, yes, you have it right, and yet you get it so wrong.
Yeah.
If you thought this through one more step, you'd be there, but you stop at big state bad.
Ignoring.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ignoring the entirety of the rest of society.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's basically his problem. He doesn't make any mention of class, make any mention of economics or anything like that. He's just focused on the state.
And the thing that's dumb about that too, I'll just say really quickly, is that it's like how are you critiquing the state? It is deterministic. It's how are you critiquing the state without explaining the reasons why the state has power and can maintain power? That seems, it's just so asinine. It's dude, think about it. Why does the state have power? It's not like fucking God. It doesn't just have some divine power.
It has power because it has power, and because history moves forward, it will have more power. Is basically his theory.
Right. Yeah.
It can be very circular because it lacks.
Yeah.
Some of the fundamentals. Anyway.
Right.
I'll try not to talk too much more about that school because it's by far the smallest school because most people acknowledge the importance of class and social relationships outside of the state in the French Revolution. Anyway, so we've discussed the revisionists and Tocquevillians. Now we're gonna discuss Lynn Hunt. This Lynn Hunt is where I draw a lot of this information about the revisionists and the Tocquevillians, as well as other objections to the Marxist perspective from. She's a historian. She's decently popular. If you're a history major, you've probably heard of her at some point. Specifically, a lot of the information I get to inform what I'm talking about comes from her book, Politics, Culture, and Class in the French Revolution, which I mostly skimmed through because I was on the timeline for that paper.
Hey, at least you're transparent about it, though. That's the important part. I gotta say too, as a quick aside, bad title. Not a very good title. It's
longer than that. That's the abbreviation.
Oh my god, dude. Yeah, no, I ain't about it.
Yeah, yeah. I disagree with most of her sort of conclusions, but she does bring up valid objections to the Marxist perspective that I think help us develop the Marxist perspective that I'll get into. Yeah, so that's where all of this sort of previous information about the critiques of the Marxist perspective comes from.
Yeah.
Um, the most relevant chapter in the book to what we're talking about is called The New Political Class, where she essentially analyzes the social composition of the people in power in the French Revolution, as well as analyzes the social position of people who support the revolution and people who were opposed to the revolution. Um, and what she found was that, she found that essentially the new political class was, I forgot the exact quote, but she says something along the lines of, the Marxist perspective was not so much incorrect broadly as it was insufficiently like complex in its details, something like that.
Okay.
Which is a pretty weird objection, but
Yeah.
anyway.
Well, that's often
So
an objection to Marxist critiques of things because
yeah,
the people, like we talked about a couple episodes ago, the people that are reading it aren't reading it close enough. So they're like, this is very simple. It's like, no, you're very simple. It's very, you know what I mean? Like, it's very comprehensive. You're just not thinking about it very much, you know?
yeah, and also they're like using it as a way to dismiss the theory entirely instead of trying to develop
To critique
what
it.
whole
Yeah.
revolution has.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
the theory has.
Yeah.
Um,
For sure.
but anyway, so she talks about how the revolutionary class which enacted the revolution was essentially bourgeois, but that the bourgeois class was not united in its support for the revolution. And essentially the difference was geographic, to my understanding, if I remember the book rightly, the difference between a bourgeois person who supported the revolution and didn't was whether or not they lived in like an urbanized area. Kind of like a little
Rural urban
analogous
split.
to the US.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. A bit like Democrat versus Republican.
I'm dead.
Um,
No, I'm good.
Not yet.
I'm good. Drink in his face. There we go.
Oh,
Oh. All right, hold on. All right. Let me concentrate a
focus.
sec. All right, I'm out of Estus.
No.
It's okay. It's okay. I got trapped is the problem.
Yeah. I mean, this would be like your first death.
It would be my first death.
So, I mean, I'm still using the 5 count because I'm.
Oh yeah. Oh no, please do. Please do.
Anyway.
There we go. There we go. That's number 6.
But we'll say this one doesn't count.
No, what do you what? No,
So,
of course it counts.
You had to replay this.
No, but of course it counts.
Okay, so you're at 6.
I'm at 6. Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Of course it counts.
I'm fine with biasing it towards myself.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and it makes me look like more of a badass, so. All right, go on.
Okay. What were we talking? We were talking about Lynn Hunt and her critiques of the Marxist perspective. So, she's not totally in line with revisionists, but she talks about how the bourgeois class was not united in its support for the revolution because there was an urban-rural divide.
Yes.
Between the bourgeois people who supported the revolution. She talks about, she briefly mentions that there were liberal aristocrats who favored reform in the beginning, but she also points out that most of them became counter-revolutionaries once the revolution became more radical.
Classic.
And she also mentions how, again, most of the people in the actual elected offices, the government in the revolution, weren't themselves bourgeois, which is, they were lawyers, which is supposed to be an objection to, like, I'll get into the response to this in a minute, because this is bad, this is wrong.
But since when, I just don't really understand. Since when are lawyers not bourgeois? Like, they're not, lawyers historically weren't aristocracy, they were a middle class position. I don't know. That seems like a strange critique.
Yeah, it's because they define the revisionists tend to define who's bourgeois strictly as who owns the means of production. And since lawyers weren't technically owning factories or whatever,
Yeah. Mills.
You know, they don't count as bourgeois. But, you know, they do own, like, intellectual capital.
Right, yeah.
By being lawyers. And there's another objection as well that I'll get into, hopefully, if I remember it in a few minutes. But anyway, so those are essentially her objections to it, that the bourgeois class wasn't united, and that as a result, culture must play an equal role to class in determining who was for and against the revolution, because people in the, you know, urban areas were for it, and in the rural areas were against it, and they had like different spheres.
Yeah.
But here's the problem. And so this next section will be me addressing these objections. It's informed by a number of works by different historians, but the two primary ones, the most important one is called Connecting Capitalism to the French Revolution by William Sewell, which is like a paper. It's like 40 pages. If you're really into this stuff, I highly recommend this one. And a sort of complementary work would be two things called, the first one's called The Public Sphere and Public Opinion by Roger Chartier, something like that, and The Great Chain of Buying by Colin Jones. Again, only look at those if you really want to get into this shit.
And you have a subscription to a journal and can get them.
Yeah, you could probably find them pretty easily. But anyway, so essentially what they talk about is how, yes, there were cultural differences that helped decide who were for and against the revolution, but those cultural differences were influenced by and largely made possible by the development of capitalism, which I'll get into, which I'm about to explain more detail. Half this video is just me saying I'm about to explain
get to that.
this.
Yeah.
First, we're going to talk about Sewell's paper, which is Connecting Capitalism to the French Revolution. It also has a much longer title, but I'm trying to be kind. I'm trying to be kind to people. But what this one talks about is public spaces in urbanized areas in the French Revolution.
Oh, the commons.
Yeah, not quite the commons.
Oh, okay.
But what he calls the Parisian promenades. These spaces were dominant in Paris, which is also where the revolution was dominant.
Yeah.
But they existed in other cities as well. Essentially, these are like the modern downtowns, you know?
Yeah.
This is where people go to, this is where all the cafes in the French Revolution were. This was where people went to, like, go for a stroll, go shopping, all sorts of shit. And this is like the proper analogy is like, it's downtown.
Yeah.
Which was something new developing in urban areas nearly to the extent that had previously. He also makes a bunch of different categories that I won't go into for the different types of Parisian promenades. There are like boulevards, other ones, and there's like refined details, but I'm gonna try and avoid going into that. But essentially,
I will add a detail really fast just because I think it's cool.
Yeah.
Europeans and like the French especially got that idea from those who did it before them, namely the Persians and some Middle Eastern societies as well. It was more common there, but especially the city of Isfahan was in Persia. Modern day Iran was the first, like, considered to be the first modern city. Like, it had like in like I think it was like the late 16th century, it had like a clock tower for people to like know what time it was, which was like a crazy brand new thing. Anyway, that's just a cool tidbit that I.
Yeah, no, the Persians are one of the most metropolitan cultures in history for a long time.
They're awesome.
Yeah, and we could it's kind of a separate discussion as to why capitalism didn't develop there as opposed to Europe, even though they had like these more urbanized spaces, but we won't go into that. Essentially, the reason these places started developing was because of the new luxury market that became available to the Europeans because of colonization and the early development of capitalism and like primitive accumulation.
Yeah. Can you quickly describe primitive accumulation for the folks at home?
Yeah, so it's a pretty jargony term. I did not read that chapter on capital, so I can't.
No!
Shit. Oh, that's
Oh, man.
But essentially, primitive accumulation, to my understanding, is the process by which capitalists accumulate property from people who originally owned it to develop their dominance over society. So, like, initially,
not quite.
Property was
not quite. Primitive accumulation.
Not quite.
Yeah, no. The primitive part is that it was before capitalism. It was before capitalists. It was the land that was acquired through warfare in the time of feudalism or before.
Okay.
So it's basically like the primitive accumulation means the stuff that was attained and then seized by capitalists before there were capitalists.
So what did I say? Did I say like capital?
Yeah, you said that the capitalists take the land from like where capitalists get their stuff, and I'm saying that the
this was before they were capitalists.
Correct. Yeah, there's a step in between, which is like kingdoms and stuff and warfare like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So primitive accumulation is like the I guess you could say the monopolization of land by elites that help pave the way for capitalism.
Yep, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And so primitive accumulation was very key to this process of urbanization and developing these public spaces because there was suddenly a new luxury market from like goods from the Americas and from abroad, as well as there was an increased, surplus, which is the Marxist terminology where, as land gets monopolized, and there's fewer people who need to live off that land, for example, the genocide of the Native American.
Right.
There's less resources that need to be devoted to reproducing the working class and keeping them alive, and more resources can be essentially taken by the wealthy for just fulfilling their wants. And that's, surplus is another conversation that we won't go into.
Right.
But essentially, part of feudal ideology is this idea of prestige. And so, part of what makes a noble powerful is having other people respect him, respect his power, respect his wealth, and essentially trying to flex on the others to prove that he's the best.
Weird flex, but okay.
And part of that is through owning luxuries. Whatever noble has the most gold, has the fanciest hat or whatever bullshit,
right,
is has more prestige and is cooler than the other ones, and thus is like a little more powerful than the others. So part of the feudal competition for power rests on this market for luxury items that help grant prestige and power in the feudal society.
Yeah.
And so, as markets expand, as more luxuries were introduced to the market, things like spices, things like silk, other things included, through colonization, through conquest of other lands, and like European dominance of countries in Africa and Asia, like taking over the government, forcing them to give them things like silk, all that stuff. Essentially, through Western imperialism, Europe got access to more luxuries that then the nobles would need to spend money to buy to, maintain their prestige and, keep up with the Bensons or whatever the phrase is.
Joneses. The Bensons?
Joneses. They're close. They're close.
The fuck is a Benson?
Benson's a name.
Keeping up with the Bensons. All right, we chose the wrong name for our channel. We should be keeping up with the Bensons for sure.
No, we should not. Oh, shit. We will not be keeping up with the Bensons.
Keeping up with the Bensons. All right.
Anyway.
Also, congratulations to me.
you know, part of what Marx talks about with, capitalism making its gravediggers is how there are parts of capitalism that makes it essentially destroy itself. And the same goes for feudalism, where, this feudal drive to gain more luxuries and gain more prestige helped dig the grave for feudalism, because what the nobles did in their drive to buy these luxury items was enrich the bourgeois, because that's who they were buying these luxuries from.
Yeah.
The bourgeois were the merchants, were the plantation owners who went out and got these luxury items from abroad and brought them to Europe, that then, the nobles would shower in money to feed their insatiable need for prestige.
Yes.
And that's part of. Go ahead.
I just said yes, but I will also mention that it was a symbiotic relationship too, because the merchants were only able to do a lot of those things with the express permission and investment of feudal lords and kings and stuff.
Yeah.
And so it became this
Absolutely.
sort of the feudal kings would take on the monetary first investment, and then the merchants,
as well as the military costs.
Yeah, and then the merchants would take on the risk. Many of them, died in the colonies and all these types of things. So yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it was the feudal state that conquered these territories for the merchant.
Right.
So Patrick's absolutely right. And then, as these luxury markets increased, what would happen is that there would have to be a place to sell them at home in Europe. And that's where the Parisian promenades come in. They were essentially where people gathered to buy, sell these luxury items, as well as to show them off. And this is a key point. So part of, that idea of feudal prestige is a lord and his lady going down the boulevard in their fancy ass like nowadays or whatever, and strutting their stuff.
You cut out a little bit there. The lords and ladies are doing what?
Rolling down the boulevard, pulling up in their carriage, their feudal Ferrari.
Yeah. Got the entourage.
Strutting their stuff.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. They got their retainers,
Exactly. And here's the thing, and here's why William Swell argues that this helped form the cultural foundation for the French Revolution and for capitalism. The people selling these items were not nobles. They were commoners, they were merchants, they were the third estate, which, is the amalgamation of those groups in France at this time. I'll try not to define what the other estates are, because that's a bit jargon. Anyway, and besides the point.
It's essentially just the nobility and the clergy.
Yeah. The nobility are the second estate, and the clergy were the first estate.
Yeah.
That's the terminology of the time. So traditionally in feudal palaces and that sort of thing, the only commoners who were allowed in were servants of the lords. You couldn't get in as some peasant into fucking Versailles,
Are you sure about that? Because I played this game that was a historical game called Assassin's Creed, and I was sneaking into people's castles and stuff all the time. So I don't know. I think you need to check your facts on that one.
Okay. My mistake. For a second I thought you were actually being.
I know you did.
I was like, oh fuck, do I not know something? But yeah, Assassin's Creed, believe it or not, is not a totally immersive historical experience.
Is that right? Oh, okay. All right. I thought there was a shadow cabal running everything.
No, the Templars have not been running society since the 1100s or whatever.
I thought it was all fact.
Isn't that a documentary?
I feel lied to. I feel lied to. Ubisoft, you lied to me. I want my money back for all those years.
Big bullshit.
Yeah.
But anyway, so what was unique about the promenades and the public spaces and these sort of luxury marketplaces was that they had to let commoners in, because commoners were the people who were selling this stuff.
Right.
and also they were just like public streets. And part of the point was that you want, as a noble, to be able to flex on the fucking stupid peasants.
That's right.
And show off your fancy hat to all these poor nobodies who don't have one.
That's right.
But so commoners are allowed into these spaces, into these public luxury marketplaces, because they had to be. And then, as part of the fact that the wealthy, the bourgeois, are gaining money through this luxury market and selling luxuries to the nobility, they are then themselves able to afford the luxury, flex on them,
Yeah.
So now, the original point was that you would have Lord and Lady Benson going down the boulevard in their fancy-ass carriage, strutting down the lineage. Before you know it, you have fucking manager Dave and his wife, who don't have any noble blood in them, come from fucking peasants and shit.
Yes.
But they're also rich because they've been selling silk to all these noble assholes.
Right. A couple of rich bitches.
Now they got a carriage, and they're strutting down the boulevard, looking fancy, looking good, and they got the fancy hats.
Right.
And
it's all about those hats.
People can't tell the difference, huh?
It's all about those hats, man.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what drove medieval French society.
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. Nobody can tell the difference.
People can't tell the difference between them anymore. They start to become equal in prestige and such to the nobility, and those social distinctions at the boulevard start to fade away. A lot like how social distinctions in a modern city fade away.
Yeah.
It's harder to tell nowadays just by looking at a person whether or not they're rich or just like have a somewhat fancy job.
Right. Or like Bill Gates, who just wears like t-shirts and
polos,
jeans or whatever. Yeah, and it's like he's a billionaire, but
yeah. Whereas before this, like, you could very easily tell what class someone was in just by what they were wearing.
Right.
Peasants had the rags.
Yeah, that's rags to riches. That's the fucking whole thing.
Yeah, that's essentially the lesson of this video.
Yeah, rags to bitches.
Oh my god. Anyway, so the peasants before this were always dressed in fucking rags. Clergy might have a modest robe, and the nobles would universally have all this fancy shit, all these jewels, all this shit that the peasants dug up for them and that they then took because otherwise they would break their kneecaps.
Right. Right.
But now it was no longer that simple. Now you could have people who are, by blood just commoners, but who got money off the luxury market and who can now become virtually indistinguishable from the nobles who are, in theory, supposed to be above them in feudal society. Right.
Oh, fuck.
And what I call him William because I can't say his last name, Sewell, what he relates this to in Marxist ideology is the idea of abstract versus concrete use values, and just this general theme of abstraction, which I'll explain in a second. Essentially, Marx, one of the things he emphasizes in his works is that in previous economic systems before capitalism, like feudalism, people produce things largely to use them themselves.
Yes.
And what he calls that is the production of use values. So, like, a peasant mostly grew food that he would eat. He wouldn't usually make food to sell to other people. Part of what makes capitalism unique is the production of abstract values. So what that abstract or exchange values, where essentially people are producing things not to use them, but to sell.
Mm-hmm.
So an example is, instead of a peasant just growing corn to eat, or not corn because they didn't have that, but wheat or whatever, potato, they also didn't have potatoes. But like, boring ass shit that medieval peasants ate.
Yes,
whatever.
Yes. Yeah, grain.
Instead of that, now you have plantation owners growing sugar, growing cotton to sell on the market for a monetary value instead of growing it for themselves for use. That's the basic idea of what he calls what Marx calls the duality of the commodity. And what Swell relates this to is that now, instead of having like sort of concrete identities in the sort of public spaces that people inhabited, where everyone could easily tell on an individual basis who was a noble, who was a commoner, who was a clergyman. Now, because the bourgeois are able to emulate the clothing and wear of the nobles, things are becoming more abstract and less concrete. And essentially, this contributes to like this idea of civic identity in the French Revolution, where everyone's just a citizen, everyone's inherently politically equal to one another. Because you can no longer, tell who's who.
Right.
Because the bourgeois are able to emulate the old styles of the nobility, and they look like they're the same. So therefore, people have this hierarchical mindset of the nobility are always on the top. That becomes less entrenched in people's mind because the bourgeois are now clearly able to rival them.
So okay,
right?
Let's back up for a second here.
That was all very complex.
No, this is still okay, but this is still the cultural explanation, correct?
Yeah. So this is what explains the cultural distinction between the rural bourgeois who did not support the revolution.
Oh, right.
And the urban bourgeois who did.
Got it.
Right?
Yeah.
So the rural bourgeois who did exist, like there have been studies that have proven that there were a lot of shopkeepers and artisans out in the boonies who did not support the revolution.
I mean, there had to be. They had. I mean, they had services for the small towns as well. I mean.
Yeah. And Lynn Hunt's argument is that they don't support the revolution just because they're culturally opposed to it, and she offers no explanation that cultural difference comes about. She just says it exists because it exists.
Right.
But
classic liberal argument.
Classic liberal.
Classic. Yeah.
But what the development of the Marxist perspective is that yes, those cultural distinctions exist, but they exist exactly because of the development of capitalism.
Yeah.
So those public spaces which socialize people to accept this idea of civic equality, that the bourgeois or commoners could be equal to the nobility, they accepted that because of their exposure to public areas in urban areas, like the promenades, like the boulevards, that came to exist because of the development of capitalist markets and the luxury goods market, which was in of itself tied up with the economic development of capitalism. And what that shows is that, culture doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's in many ways informed by economic developments. The difference between the bourgeois who supported the revolution and the bourgeois class that opposed the revolution was that one was socialized through these urban areas that were created by capitalist development, and the other, the rural bourgeois, were stuck in, these rural areas that didn't have access to those luxury markets as much, who didn't gain that sort of abstract sense of equality that comes with not being able to instantly tell who's a nobleman and who's just a commoner.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Let me look at my notes really quick. So that's one of the biggest revelations. And then one of the other things that I talked about, that I mentioned earlier, was I said I would explain the origin of the liberal nobility, who at the onset of the appeared as though they were going to support the reforms that were being offered up by the commoners. And the difference between the liberal aristocracy and the more hardline aristocracy was that the liberal aristocracy were also partially socialized through these public areas. They were the aristocracy who spent most of their time in Paris or in major cities, who, were going down these boulevards and saw that these sort of social distinctions were away. And so they also became more likely to be class traders because they were social institutions that were developed by capitalism.
They did what with those institutions?
They were exposed to these social institutions.
Got it.
That were developed by capitalism and spent a lot of time in them, and that, is part of what brought them away from their traditional class interests.
Got it.
Do you have anything you want to add? Any questions so far?
No, I'm following.
Okay. So the next thing that I'm going to explain is the question of the lawyers. The next thing that people point to supposedly as evidence that, the bourgeois weren't running society was that they weren't themselves holding positions of power. It was the lawyers who held positions of power. Like they were the representatives in National Convention. They, made up the bureaucracy for the most part, all that shit.
Wrote the laws.
Instead of...
Wrote the laws.
Exactly. But first, as we talked about, lawyers do have a form of capital and could probably be defined as capitalism themselves. They have intellectual capital,
right,
which they gain through the university, through gaining these social skills, which were only possible because they had money to invest in going to those places.
Yeah.
And so they themselves probably can be defined as bourgeois. But another point that I would make is that there's also this, as we talked about, this tendency under capitalism for abstraction, where instead of something doing something itself, something does something through something else.
Yes.
Instead of the concrete identities of people determining their social value, what, the abstract idea of who they are because of what they wear becomes more dominant. That's a kind of bad example. A better example is, going back to the idea of the commodity. Concrete use values that you make for yourself versus abstract exchange values that you make to sell to other people.
Right.
And so the capitalist class does not rule through itself concretely, it rules by abstraction through lawyers. Because not only do lawyers have intellectual skills that they paid for, what you could call intellectual capital, they also are entirely reliant on capitalist class primarily to use that intellectual capital.
Yes, right.
It's not fucking Joe the
peasant
lumberer who's hiring a lawyer.
Right.
It's fucking, I forget my example capitalist.
Benson, the Benson family.
No, the Bensons are the nobility.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Lady Benson.
Oh, the Joneses? I don't know.
Maybe, sure.
But we know...
it's the Joneses. It's the fucking slave-owning, plantation-owning Jones man who, hires the lawyer to go sue the fucking noble for, not respecting his access to the market. Whatever bullshit example would come up with.
So Benson is the nobility. Jonesman is going to be the the capitalist. Jonesman.
There we go. So, as we talked about, lawyers themselves can be considered capitalists because they have intellectual capital, they have their degrees, they have all the niche law shit that they've been taught in university that they had to pay for because they could afford it by being already rich in most cases. And then they also are reliant on the bourgeois class for their incomes because that's who they serve using their skills primarily. And that continues on to this day. The sort of Bloombergs of the world are far outnumbered by the Obamas, and it's pretty rare for someone who is a businessman to be, for example, president. It's usually someone who has a law degree and some background there. And sometimes there's exceptions to that. The prime example being someone like Bloomberg, but those don't often pan out super well because, people are usually a bit more mistrustful of the wealthy. The working class is usually more someone who's not directly their boss and is directly screwing them over.
A better example might be Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
Because he wasn't a lawyer.
Yeah. They rule through someone who's popular because they're a movie star.
Have you been counting my deaths, by the way?
I think this is like 8 total.
Might be 9.
Might be 9. So yeah. Also, the other thing that lawyers have that makes them more suitable for being in government and ruling for the bourgeois is that they have like the legal, bureaucratic, quote-unquote skills needed to run a modern capitalist state.
Yes.
And so that's another reason why they themselves capitalist class directly. But they're, again, subservient to the capitalist class for a number of reasons I'll briefly go over. First of all, they are themselves a sort of capitalists. Second of all, they drive their income through the capitalists. And in the context of more modern America specifically, politicians have to fund their campaigns through the contributions of extremely wealthy individuals and corporations. And they're entirely reliant on that to get into office in the first place. And the more deeper thing is that they also are forced to enact capitalist policies because of capitalist control over the economy, where a lot of the time, even if you have someone who's more liberal or left-leaning, because of the fact that if they want to enact something like Medicare for all or what have you, the capitalists could essentially force a depression on the economy that would then cause the person to immediately lose an election through withdrawing their investments, refusing to pay workers, refusing to hire more people, and that sort of thing.
Right.
So through all these mechanisms, lawyers, even if they're on paper independently running the government, are actually subservient to the bourgeois, the capitalist class.